Everybody good? Sound level okay? I think I've got a couple of my counselors joining us from finances. Usual as we meet each day for the press conference. Let me just talk with some COVID-19 related things. I think you've all been following that as we suspected, phase 3 will be opening on Friday, which is very good news for our local restaurants. And the remainder of the personal care industry that was not open under phase 2, those are the nail salons, the massage therapists, etc. They're now allowed to be open, and you can go to the nyforward.gov website to get the various protocols and details for all those enterprises. Obviously, we're doing very, very well up here in this area, and that's what allowed us to be one of only half the regions that was allowed to go to phase 3 today. Again, today, no new positive cases in Clinton County. As a matter of fact, we haven't had a positive case in Clinton County since June 1. I'll give you a second to set up if you like.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. I know there's a lot going on today. Make it to you last, Chief, because probably most of the questions are going to be on that. So,
I'm good.
ready to go?
Yeah, thanks.
So as I mentioned, we are moving to phase 3 in North Country, one of only 5 regions in the state that has been allowed to move to phase 3. It includes food service and personal care. Personal care includes tattoo and piercing facilities, appearance enhancement practitioners, massage therapy, spas, tanning, cosmetology, nail specialty, and waxing. Also, local areas are given the discretion to open public pools and playgrounds, so we'll certainly be working on some protocols locally on that, probably as early as tomorrow. There's been no new cases in Clinton County since June 1. There's only been 17 new cases in the entire North Country since June 1. The magic number for this is usually 14 days because that's the incubation period and the length it takes to be infected to being cured. So if we can hold this for another few days, it's what, June 11th already? When New Zealand was able to hold that infection-free for a couple of weeks, they declared their nation infection-free. So I stated yesterday, wouldn't it be amazing if we just put a bubble over the Clinton County, because we're protected essentially here. What makes us vulnerable is the people that come in and out constantly and potentially bring infections here. So we've done an incredibly good job of social distancing and mask wearing right from the very get-go, better than even our North Country counterparts. And that's really demonstrated ever since April 4th, when our numbers started going down dramatically from being on a really uphill trajectory. And the opening up of phase 3 just really indicates all the success we're having here. Now this one makes us a little bit more nervous because there's a lot more close contact we'll be seeing in phase 3. But I know the restaurateurs certainly will value being able to start up again, albeit at a very reduced level, reduced capacity according to the protocols. And I know we all want to succeed, and I know we're also determined to not let the infection get out of hand. If there's any blips in the data at all, I'm sure we're going to act accordingly. Also on Saturday, the governor's 202.4 order, or governor's pause order, will end, so he's going to have to renew that in the next couple of days or not. I imagine in this case, he may also differentiate different communities and be willing to lift the pause order up here, but we'll wait and see, and I'll report to you as I hear. I gave you the statistics, really low case counts, no new cases, 1,281 tests across the entire North Country from yesterday, and only 4 new cases across North Country, and again, none in Clinton County. New York State has now 172,375 positives outside of New York City. Entire state has 402,000 known positives now, over the 400,000 mark. But reassuringly, New York State is only 7th in the nation now for positive cases on a daily basis, from the first in the nation just a few days ago. So we're really, really coming down the curve nicely. Unfortunately, as you're reading, the rest of the country's starting to have another wave coming. We saw a decline, but we're seeing as complacency grows an acceleration of cases elsewhere, but not in New York. I think we're really doing it right here. And I'm somewhat concerned about India. Now they've joined the worst 3 of US, Brazil, and Russia for the most number of cases. India went from about number 10 just a week or so ago to number 4. The terrible situation there, as you're reading about in Brazil. So I think for North Country, and especially for Plattsburgh and Clinton County, the news is very, very good. Best in state in absolutely every single benchmark. Not quite as much testing than in some other areas, but still 3 times more, 2 times more than we need to do to maintain the standards that the governor imposed. And the argument is, if we simply don't have any infections, we did, like I said, 1,281 tests and didn't have a single recorded positive case. If you do all that testing, you have absolutely no infections. Maybe the tests are best used in some other area where it's having still outbreaks, et cetera. So I think everything from a public health point of view, and in turn from an economic point of view, is coming along very, very nicely. We're still very concerned in our area. So I'll talk a little bit next about our budget. As you know, the councilors passed their budget, or their budget outlook, their 5-year outlook last week. They left me with the enviable task of still coming up with further reductions in the 2021 budget to meet their 2021 target over their 5-year plan, and to still leave a deficit at the end of 2021, or the deficit next year, of around $800,000 or $900,000 deficit. So we still have some digging out to do. We still have to, and by the way, the ongoing 5-year plan still is really tough. It assumes, by the way, that we're going to have a vaccine next year. We're going to start digging out from this hole slowly over time over the next 5 years. The Federal Reserve chairman yesterday said that they expect they're going to need to continue to intervene in the financial markets for years to come. We are in a recession. Since we met last, that recession has been officially announced in the United States. We're also probably experiencing a slight deflation in prices. A deflation plus a recession actually equals a depression. But when we start turning the corner, which could be as early as this fall or maybe early next year, that means we bottomed out and we're starting to improve. The Federal Reserve is concerned how long it takes to go from bottoming out to about back to where we were, and that's going to take many, many, many years. And as a consequence, the 5- and 10-year plan my colleagues work on has to anticipate probably reduced revenue and maybe some increased expenses for many years to come. And they're doing that. At this point, when I put out my budget that meets their numbers, they'll be working with this for the next 2 or 3 or 4 months. Actually, can work on it technically right until January. And they're going to need to really make some structural changes in the way we do some things to make sure that we don't have this perennial deficit every year for the next few years. And they're up to it. I think they know some of the things that we need to do. We've been working on that. But we need to really take care of a structural problem right now that's not going to go away very, very quickly. So a budget is really only part of a 5-year strategic plan. Met the targets for next year, but there's definitely still some work that we're going to do from a planning perspective. By the way, their analysis and my analysis is in agreement. This isn't at all a worst case in analysis. Many things could get worse. We could have a second wave. It doesn't assume we're going to have a second wave. Markets can collapse like we saw back in 2008. It doesn't assume that that's going to occur either. So things could get worse, and of course also things could get better. So the interesting thing is, if we develop a budget, and if we modify my budget with the help of my colleagues, so we get to have a more sustainable budget year in and year out for the next few years, these hard years that doesn't require running a deficit every year, doesn't require our fund balance going into negative territory. If we could figure out how to make this a little more sustainable right now, we're in very good shape for a number of years. So you might then say, well, what happens if the Congress really does do something in July? Democrats, as you know, have already passed some packages. My office was working with a Congresswoman Stefanik to ensure that some of the elements of what she and a bipartisan bill is proposing properly reflect the various losses that the city's already endured. If we get a bailout, that's going to replenish our fund balance. It's going to get us to as good as where we were. It's going to even actually improve our fund balance a little bit because we've made some structural changes already to reduce spending in anticipation that if we didn't do something right away and there wasn't any federal aid coming forward, we'd be in really deep doo-doo very, very quickly. So if we're bailed out, that will replenish our fund balance, but it doesn't change the necessity of taking care of next year and the years after. It gives us a cushion, gives us a not as big a problem with cash flow, but we still need to balance revenue and expenses in these out years, and that's what we intend to do, bailout or not. So what the bailout will do, what I would recommend we do in the bailout is make sure we put that fund balance back to where it needs to be. It's severely depleted. It'll essentially run out almost next year, certainly by the year after. Put that fund balance where it needs to be in these difficult times. In any surpluses beyond that, I think we should use tax reductions. Give that money back to the taxpayers because they're really hurting right now, and use that as an economic tool to try to build the desirability of Plattsburgh in the minds of people who live around us, that we're not any longer that very high-priced city to live in. We're a city with similar tax rates as Watertown or Glens Falls. Or we could just use that money and start spending relatively frivolously. But if we do so, we're going to find ourselves with a depleted fund balance very, very quickly and be right back to square one. So there's a few different strategies and tools that we can work with right now, and I'll be presenting to my colleagues on the council tonight my budget to the challenge that they gave me last week. Probably one more short announcement before we talk about something that's very exciting. The governor has formed a commission to look at domestic violence. As you know, and Chief Ritter has commented, we've seen a wave of domestic violence as a part of the tensions of COVID-19, and we really welcome the governor's work in this. Obviously, it's something that now our city police have to devote an awful lot of time in working on now, and that really is the epitome of a de-escalation when you're in an environment like that. And it's just tragic what everybody's going through across this country in domestic violence. The city of Plattsburgh, as I've said before, has no tolerance for domestic violence. But this is a disease that really goes along with COVID-19, so I wanted to bring that to your attention. Now, and we've talked about this last week, and you've seen me issue other comments on this, what we've seen around the country with regard to violence against African Americans is absolutely horrible. It's almost difficult to watch. It's gone on for too long. I think we're much more aware of this now because of smartphones, cell phones, etc. So we've probably been enduring this far longer than any of us would like to admit. When we saw this occur in Minneapolis, it was just so poignant, so troubling, that the chief and I almost immediately started talking about responses. When we found out there was going to be a protest in the city of Plattsburgh, we welcomed it. We let them know that we're supportive of their First Amendment rights to collect and to air their concerns. We facilitated it. The chief and I marched along with them. We both knelt with them for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And we took a very different approach than other cities. We took an approach of accommodation and keeping people safe rather than antagonism and confronting them. And I thank the chief for his excellent intuition in doing that. And we started working on this earlier, but we're now prepared to issue a new use of force policy. It's already been signed by the chief, as a matter of fact. It's in effect for our police department. The last time that there was a revision was back in 2007. That revision probably more aptly reflected norms of the previous century than the current century. A lot has changed since then, including our public's expectation of not only being kept from fear, but feeling that they're being kept from fear as well. So the chief scoured the very best policies from across the country. Most of the policies that he looked at were actually from incredibly troubled communities that are in many cases under federal orders to clean up their act. And he adopted what I believe may be one of the best use of force policies in the country right now. It's absolutely state of the art. It does all the things that you would want it to do. For instance, banning chokeholds. You've probably been following the 8 can't wait set of recommendations. 8 recommendations for a state of the art use of force policy. It incorporates all those. It talks about de-escalation as an essential tool in the toolbox for our police force. And it addresses that not only in words, but also in deeds. They're currently revising their curriculum for their academy that's coming up to have much more emphasis on de-escalation. And they're using the skill of our academy. As you probably know, our academy attracts people across a 7-county region to be trained each year. We're using the facilitators of that academy to also retrain our officers. I think you said on a twice-yearly basis of ongoing training, but also retrain the officers from this entire region, perhaps having mini academies for recurring training for all officers, all public safety officers in this area, 7-county area. So I have to hand it to the chief to take the initiative for all this, to Ron Santor, our primary trainer, that he works with him on all this as well. I'm incredibly excited about their willingness to really take this on. You can imagine how hard it is. I might also note that under this new policy, I do not believe the city of Plattsburgh would have had any violations under this new policy were it in effect in at least the time I've been around and monitoring this. This isn't a problem that has occurred in the city of Plattsburgh before, I believe, but it certainly is something we want to pass to make sure that it never would occur in the city of Plattsburgh. And so it's a very proactive approach from the chief of police. So Chief, do you want to come and describe some of the things from your perspective and perhaps answer any questions they may have much better than I can?
Afternoon. I guess I would just open it up for any questions.
What's changed in the use of force policy that you're putting forward now versus what the city has had?
Several components. So there are, I would say, primary areas are duty to intervene. A lot of the things that were not in our policy and are in the policy now are things that you'd normally expect, but having it written out, spelled out, is what you see in major city use of force policies. So that was the approach that I took, was solidifying things such as a duty to intervene. This would have specifically addressed the the George Floyd case. Ironically, Minneapolis Police Department has a duty to intervene section in their use of force policy. So it is not a magic spell, but it specifically articulates to the public, to the citizens, what our commitment is by putting it in the policy. Other areas, I mean, it's a much longer policy. The duty to intervene, de-escalation is probably the larger component that will require significant training. A duty to intervene would, there's no real need to train on that other than as far as a rollout of policy. But de-escalation requires specific techniques that maybe need specific training, and that's the back end of this, is that putting a policy in place and specifically articulating things that are now required need to be addressed by specific training, and de-escalation is one of those. That's currently where I'm looking to find adequate training for that. It's something, our use of force policy is recurring training twice a year, like the mayor said. This is going to require a little bit of a different approach to get into the twice a year cycle. We'll have to specifically address the changes. There are a lot of changes, though. Those are just two of them. Like the mayor said, chokeholds are one. Shooting at vehicles. Drawing from my poor memory. But our policy is posted online currently, so I'd encourage anyone that wants to view it. You can go to the Plattsburgh PD website, and on the left-hand menu at the very bottom, use force policy. It's updated currently. Any other questions?
Can you just expand a little bit on, I guess, the chokeholds, the shooting at cars, some of those things that have changed?
So it specifies that those aren't permitted. It goes into much greater detail, but specifically that is what's removed. There are a lot more definitions in this policy. It addresses, in greater detail, the sanctity of human life, why we would have a policy like this. Not that it wasn't addressed in our former version of the policy. I would just say that this is much more expansive. What was relevant in a policy in 2007 is still relevant in 2020, but it addresses a lot more things in greater detail.
I guess I have one more question.
Please.
The mayor mentioned that you looked to cities that were particularly going through a tough time, might have mandates to clean up their act. Why did you want to have this proactive approach if this isn't exactly a current issue right now in the area?
That's a great question. With specific jurisdictions that maybe had a consent decree from the Department of Justice to impose certain guidelines, those were forced on them. And I found that most of the things that would be in, another document that I used was the National Consensus Policy and Discussion Paper on Use of Force. It was something that was released in 2017, and it was endorsed by 11 major law enforcement organizations like the Fraternal Order of Police, International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Association of Police Organizations. It withstood a lot of scrutiny and was endorsed by these 11 organizations. So if experts are saying that these things should be addressed in a model policy, and there are police departments that, for reasons, have had specific things imposed in their policies for lack of enforcement or adherence in a different policy. Those were the policies that had the most things addressed. That if I looked at Baltimore PD's policy, it was all encompassing of the things that were identified in that paper. Another one was San Francisco Police Department. Theirs was, I don't believe that they are in the same boat, but as far as major cities that have had major revisions of their use of force policy over many years, probably, they were the ones that I could draw the most from.
Chief, we've been hearing nationally, and even some of our next door neighbors like Burlington, the debate over whether police departments should be defunded or abolished. And while that's not necessarily a debate here in Plattsburgh, I am curious to find out what you think of that.
I will echo what the Minneapolis police chief said when it asked that same question. My oath that I swore is to protect the citizens of the city of Plattsburgh and anyone that comes into the city of Plattsburgh. We don't discriminate. So if and when and until I'm told by people that control my budget or organization, I'm going to continue to keep that oath until told otherwise. That's all I can do.
Mayor, do you have any comments on that question?
On which, for me?
What do you make of the debate going on across the country about defunding or abolishing police departments?
You know, I'm actually quite proud of our police department. I have a lot of our constituents say that they don't lock their doors. And the reason they don't lock their doors is because there's very little crime in the city of Plattsburgh, although we do see a big uptick of drug crime, as you know, because of our location and our fact we're the only city in 100 miles in New York. And we're seeing that uptick in domestic violence. But one of the reasons we have relatively low crime is because we have a good police force. I could not imagine a city functioning without a police force. I could not imagine doing the job that these individuals do. Remember that 90% of their time is dealing with people that we would almost never run across because they're part of the criminal element. And they aren't going to be abated if we don't have this deterrent effect and this proactive approach to policing. But that doesn't mean that police can't reprioritize. You know, we're talking about doing more de-escalation training. I've been thinking about the possibility of coming up with a different approach to first responders for people that may be suffering from mental illness and using the Department of Social Services resources available to us as well. To have, for instance, during the protest, I'd asked the chief to identify all his officers that have the very best rapport with the community and are very good at de-escalation. Let's have them be our ambassadors out that day. And we want to do a much more community policing. You'll see more on that as the chief develops protocols for community policing in the next little while as well. So it doesn't mean we can't reprioritize these funds we allocate to keep us safe, but I don't think we can defund public safety.
And a question on the budget. You had mentioned that you did not craft a worst-case scenario budget. I know some communities are doing that. Why not have a worst-case budget as a backup plan?
Well, I think that and I've got a statement that I'll release with the budget as well that addresses that more fully. But I believe that the Common Council already did what I would consider to be a very realistic approach. Identifying, and we started this very early on, 6 or 8 weeks ago, almost at the inception of coronavirus. It might have been around the time I put in my first social distancing order back around March 16th. We started the meeting because I, as an economist, Mr. Moore, Councillor Moore is an economist as well. We understand how recessions can go and how they can really take off. And that plan for 2020 and 2021 has evolved a little bit, but hasn't evolved all that much. I mean, what a lot of our concerns were just 2 or 3 months ago really are starting to bear. If we saw our concerns getting much, much worse, things becoming worse than we even anticipated a couple of months ago, we probably would have revised accordingly. We haven't seen them get much better, maybe a little better, and we've changed some of our assumptions accordingly. But I think it's a realistic, very realistic case. Whereas I think a lot of people, their realistic case is actually very optimistic. So yeah, we could throw into a budget a lot of real doom and gloom stuff, like everything collapses completely, but that's a very unlikely scenario. And that's what fund balances are designed to kind of cushion, the ups and downs. So I think this is a very fair and realistic case. If you recall, when we put out our first notes of concern, and the city of Plattsburgh, before any municipality around us, actually started reallocating the 2020 budget. And you recall all the heat we got at that time. Why are you doing this? You're overreacting. Well, a week later, the county ended up furloughing, I don't know, 6 or 7 times more people than we did. We acted very, very quickly, but very realistically, and I still stand by those numbers. It was the proper approach. I would not have modified much of that analysis, even for what we know now, which is probably almost 2 months later. And things could become more optimistic. We could have the cooperation of the Congress, for instance, in helping localities like they've helped states and like they've helped businesses and homeowners and renters and those unemployed, et cetera. The only entity that really hasn't been helped much is localities. But we're not assuming that's going to happen, so that's why I think it's a very realistic analysis, not at all Pollyanna. But you're right, things could get worse.
Also, just circling back to COVID, just to clarify, it was 1281 tests in the North Country, or?
Correct.
And also, just a quick question, is there anything you want to say to, with all the phases opening, just to clarify to people to still be social distancing, small gatherings, and just being careful and things like that?
You saw my graph a couple of weeks ago to show what happened within days of us starting to wear masks. Just wear a mask. When I came in, I was wearing a mask. Just wear a mask. And if we can just wear a mask, I think we can easily manage this. This one little piece of cloth makes more difference by far than any other thing we could possibly do short of a vaccine. So to the point where it's a complete no-brainer. Just wear a mask. Now, it's hard to eat wearing a mask. And that's why I have a little bit of a pause for concern about maintaining social distancing as restaurants open. But we also have a very low infection rate here, so it could be okay as long as we don't have an awful lot of infection coming into our area. We're probably fine. But this will lower your ability to transmit by probably 80 or 90%. So that RT number that the governor talks about, the RT of COVID-19 is the number of people that you're likely to infect if you're infected. If you can, and that number hovers around between 2 and 4, depending on which study you look at. You wear a mask and that number goes down to what's a fifth of 2, 0.4 to 0.8. Anything less than 1, and this thing is manageable and starts to decline. So all we need to do is do this, and this is manageable, and we keep these infections at a much lower rate, don't overwhelm our hospitals, and buy us all the time in the world for a vaccine. So it's a very simple prescription. Just wear a mask whenever you're in public. And that gives me an awful lot of confidence that if we can just keep doing that. And I can't say enough for the residents of Plattsburgh. They were just amazing when we put that order out. The day I put that order out, I had a bunch of calls, people saying, what, I gotta wear a mask? Where am I gonna get a mask? All that kind of stuff. Do I have to wear a mask when I go into work? We're getting all kinds of calls like that. But they're only asking because they really wanted to try to follow the policy. I walked home to and from work the next day, people were already wearing masks. That's all we need to do. That's why Clinton County, I believe, has some of the best statistics anywhere in the entire state. Because our residents were so diligent in doing this, which is why I believe that on phase 3, we're probably gonna be fine because we really care. Now, it's also painful for our businesses because the other part of really caring is, well, maybe do I need to go out shopping, et cetera? That's tough, really tough for our local businesses. But I've said to you before, the communities that succeed the best in pandemics are the ones that absolutely put public health first and foremost and earliest and longest. So you really manage this thing and don't let that second wave start occurring like you're seeing with complacency elsewhere in the country. So I got all kinds of reasons to be incredibly confident with all this. Very pleased.
Kind of circling back to the domestic violence information you had shared, and talking about how, you know, sort of reprioritizing policing, so this might be also a question for you, Chief. I was kind of curious what sort of like, you had mentioned the, you know, collaboration with DSS, potentially with addressing some mental health and all of that, and the topic of community policing. Can you speak more to like what that might look like moving forward?
Probably not quite yet, but maybe as early as next week might have that fleshed out a little bit more. I know that we have, as you know, I formed committees for all of our various counselors. We have a committee on public safety, and they meet frequently with the chief. And community policing is a huge value for them. They are really excited about us doing more in that area. So I think in the coming weeks, we're going to flesh that out an awful lot. Now that really is probably a bigger change in how we do things than even a use of force, because like I say, I think most everything we've done would have been consistent with the use of force, new use of force policy anyway. So we'll see, and we'll roll that out pretty quick. One other thing, by the way, on the agenda tonight, which is pretty exciting, you probably know that a couple of years or a year ago, we put out an RFP for our harbor side to see if we could renew any interest in putting some sort of development down there. Many of you who've been here for a long time recall that we built a parking lot, I call the parking lot to nowhere, for a hotel that was destined to go back in there in around 2006 or 2007. And because of the recession, they decided to not continue. We invested $1 million or so in the parking lot, but we never had that hotel. So we put out an RFP a year or two ago to see if there's any renewed interest. The primary comment we had at that time was that they wanted to see us redress the sewage, the wastewater treatment plant at that time. We put in, mostly through grants, tens of millions of dollars into upgrading that facility. That work is now all engineered, and some of the work has already begun, to the point where we felt that maybe if there's no interest a couple of years ago or a year ago because of that, let's put on RFP and approach all those developers again that came through and see if they might be interested now. And so they've gone through an RFP process again, contacted them all. Most of them, to be honest, declined because it is a very difficult environment right now. Recession, lots of uncertainty in the world. But I understand, I've not had any conversations with this individual, but I understand they've received at least one letter of interest in doing something now down at our harbor side. So the next stage would be for the Common Council to empower the city and our representatives in the city to begin discussions with that, or perhaps there's other individuals. I'm not sure if there's only one individual or not, or one entity or not, to see if there's that letter of interest or that proposal can actually get to the point of being something that the council could subsequently approve, that we could go through our same process with zoning and planning and public forums and all that kind of stuff. So I know no more details than that. I've not met the individual and discussed this. I don't have a copy of the plan myself, but this is something that's really gratifying, because many of you know the part I found most exciting about the DRI is finally being able to make the lake city truly a lake city, get people living by the lake and accessing the lake and opening up the lake. And we moved the MLD off the lake for that very reason. So now some of that is finally coming to fruition, so that's very exciting. And as I find out, or as the city proceeds, if they proceed farther with this, we'll certainly let you know any details as they emerge. That's about all I know right now. Any other questions for today?
Do you know what the company or developer who's interested is interested in doing down there?
Only roughly that I think they were interested in doing a similar thing to what was proposed earlier, back in 2008, a hotel or a mixed use, and maybe a hotel, maybe hotel slash mixed use, not and or, but perhaps both, and in the same, approximately the same footprint as was discussed more than a decade ago as well, and that brown field in between the marina and the parking lot. So, as we hear more, let's hope that there is indeed that interest out there and comes to fruition. I think that if we can succeed in developing our harbor side, you know that we're still rolling through the public process with regard to the prime proposal. We need it to, or the zoning board and the planning boards to make their determinations, a yes or no on that. We've also received the investment on from the state in allowing us to upgrade our sewage treatment plant, our wastewater plant. If you add up all these investments and add in the DRI of $10 million, we're talking somewhere in the order of about $70 million having been invested in revitalizing downtown in the last few years. And so let's hope that that all comes to fruition, that $70 million can allow many more people to live downtown, much more economic activity, many more jobs for not only our city but our entire region. $70 million is a huge investment in our downtown for a city that really has not seen almost any investment for many, many, many decades. So it's really exciting. Maybe the last investment of any sort is perhaps Bombardier back in the 1990s, I believe. So this is really, really exciting. It may be exactly what this city needs to survive, to be blunt. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have equally weighty news by next week, so I appreciate you coming out. Do you want to add anything, councilors? We have our two finance committee councilors here, as we usually do. Thank you.
Mary, Thomas wants to double check. I think he's gonna put your Facebook page with the debate. I'm not sure if this is what you use for your. Is this?
I think it is.
This,
Yeah.
yeah. I was gonna say, this is what I see you post on, but I didn't know. I was on the wrong one.
Yeah. And I say question, which we're not very good at Facebook, but make sure that's the one.
This is the one that I see you post on regularly. If you want us to be safe, email him the link.
Okay.
So yeah.
So is he looking for a photo or what my Facebook page looks like?
I think he's just trying to link it to the website because they have their airline debate tomorrow. And I'm assuming you're gonna have all of the lists. Hey, you know, you want to follow your candidates.
Oh, I see. I don't really have a campaign page. I don't ever talk about
It's just your
campaign. It's just my page, right? I don't even have the word mayor on it anywhere, so, or candidate on it anywhere, so.
Okay.
That's as close to a campaign page as I guess I have.
All right. Thanks, Mary.
You bet. Good job, Chief. Appreciate you coming by.
I think going down the steps will be